Our next speaker is Ryan Barrett with PEI Potato Board, and Ryan will be speaking on Bio-Fumigant Crops.
Alrighty. Thanks very much to AGC for having me today. Some of you guys may be wondering why you have me from the Potato Board talking to you today. I think it's a lot of you would have your land in rotation with potatoes. Some of you are potato growers, some of you trade or you rent with potato growers. And I think there's examining the dynamics, the changing dynamics in crop rotation between that we're seeing within the potato rotations that definitely has an impact on grain and soybean and a lot of the different things that are being grown other than potatoes. I grew up on a dairy farm that also grew potatoes, and so understanding a little bit about how these different crops are interacting with each other and hopefully helping us all come ahead is a little bit of what I want to talk about today. So as you know, there's a lot of soil, I'm going to say yield limiting diseases and pests and things that we're seeing in potato rotation. Some of these things also impact other crops. Things like verticillium wilt, which is the first one up there. It's known as early dying in potatoes and root lesion nematodes. But verticillium and root lesion nematodes can be an issue in alfalfa, it can be an issue in soybeans, it can be an issue in peas, so it's not limited just to potatoes. Scab, of course, is a big issue on potatoes. Wireworm, of course. We've seen corn fields that haven't emerged, soybean fields that haven't emerged properly because of wireworm, so that's an issue. And then all these sorts of things, these are an impact no matter what we're growing. Low organic matter, soil compaction, low aggregate stability, pH or fertility issues. These are all things that affect every crop we grow. So we're learning a little bit as we go along. There isn't a one-size-fits-all crop rotation or optimal crop rotation. Depends on your soil, depends on what you need to grow, depends on your soil types and your length of rotation, and what you're trying to achieve, and maybe what the biggest factor is that may be limiting your yield. So in potatoes, it's going to be a difference in choice of what you're going to put in your rotation, whether it's wireworm is your biggest issue, whether it's early dying that's your biggest issue, whether it's the fact that you've got really sandy, low organic matter soil. That's going to lead you to make different choices as to what's going to go in your crop rotation. So I think it's very important to always try and properly diagnose what a field's limitations are. You do that through your crop history and seeing how your crop has evolved over time. But it's also important to do your diagnostic testing like soil sampling, your traditional soil sampling, as well as additional types of testing like nematode testing, like the new soil health testing that the province offers. Some of these types of things to better understand what may be the limitations in your field. Just a real quick overview on potato early dying, because this is one of the major reasons we are seeing big changes in our rotation. PEI doesn't have access to soil fumigation like a lot of places that grow potatoes in North America. And in most places, soil fumigation is the #1 tool for battling verticillium wilt and potato early dying. So in PEI, what are we trying to do? And by potato early dying, it's a complex primarily between verticillium, which is a soil-borne fungus, and root lesion nematodes, Pradolenchus penetrans, which they kind of combine. The presence of both are synergistic in terms of causing that plant to die earlier than it should and lower yields. So the two main approaches to battling this through rotation is Bio-Fumigant crops, things like mustards and other brassicas that you're tilling into the ground to release a biofumigant chemical to kill the bad actors in the soil. Or we have more along the lines of like what we call a trap crop, which don't necessarily require incorporation, but there's something in their roots, something in how they grow is actively interfering with some of these pests and diseases. And that's where we're talking about things like Sudan grass and pearl millet and some other crops. So again, testing, if you're a potato grower or you're growing in rotation with potatoes, you're trading land, that sort of thing, it's really important to get an idea of whether your field is good, bad, or medium, or whatever for these types of tests. There is testing here in PEI, Potato Quality Institute in Charlottetown offers verticillium and nematode testing. So it is an option for understanding what the levels are in your field. Just going to talk about some of these individual crops and maybe how they apply and what some pros and cons or how they fit. Mustards, we saw probably a peak on mustards 2 or 3 years ago. I'd say the mustard acreage has gone down a little bit again the last couple of years. Primarily it gained favor due to wireworms, because there's multiple studies over the last, I don't know, 8 to 10 years in PEI that's shown that brown mustard is shown to reduce wireworm damage in potatoes. And it has effect not just as a cover crop, so just growing it has an effect, but also incorporating it as a green manure and maybe double cropping it has an even stronger effect. When we're talking about things like early dying, over in New Brunswick, they've been showing that using it as a bio-fumigant crop with mustard has shown similar levels to chloropicrin fumigation. So the amount of extra yield they got and the quality was similar as if they actually went in and put chloropicrin in the ground. In PEI, we've seen some results that are similar to that, and we've seen some that are a little more inconsistent. I would say a big part of it is the choice of variety, or the choice of mustard. There's a difference between brown mustard, centennial mustard, and then like a mustard that's bred particularly for biofumigation, so there's a difference there. There's also a big difference in terms of time of incorporation, whether you're putting it in under the ideal circumstances, putting it in when there's moisture in the ground, is the amount of biomass, all those sorts of things. So that probably leads to differences in effectiveness. And then it also doesn't have just an effect on early dying, it can also help bring down some of the other issues in the soil that may be around, and that may be an issue for multiple crops. So things like rhizoctonia, black dot, pythium, so some of those soil-borne funguses, it'll help bring some of those things down. Some of you would know or would have experience of growing brown mustard as a cash crop, so you can grow it straight out as a cash crop. If your main worry is wireworm and you're just trying to keep mustard in the field as long as possible to help lower wireworm populations, you can grow it out as its own cash crop, or it can be interseeded with peas. We've got a few growers in PEI that have had success with this the last couple of years. You can harvest it together and then separate it in the yard, or you can, if you're just putting in a little bit of mustard, you're not worried about collecting it, you can just blow it out the back of the combine, and it's going to be a cover crop for the fall. Again, you're doing some protection of the soil, but you're also maybe helping with wireworm and some of those sorts of things. So there's, depending on your setup and what you can do and what you can do time-wise, you got some flexibility there. In terms of a cover crop, we've got some people that are using mustards as a fall cover. Again, mostly targeting wireworm control. If you're going to do that, I would say make sure you're getting it in August and at the latest early September, because after that, your establishment isn't going to be very good. You're not going to have a lot of biomass going into the winter, and it's an expensive cover crop if you're not getting a really good catch. So just a few considerations. A couple of my things maybe got cut off here by the picture a little bit. It's probably not the ideal choice for building soil organic matter. Anything is better than nothing. Anything green growing in the summer and fall is better than nothing growing. But if building organic matter is your biggest consideration, there's probably choices other than mustard that I would pick. Doesn't overwinter well in PEI like it does in, say, Europe or other places. By spring, even if you've got a nice crop of it, the biomass kind of goes down to not very much. But again, it's still, for the effect for wireworm rotations, it could be quite valuable. We have a little bit conflicting reports in PEI, and the data's sort of we're not 100% sure what it's doing for verticillium and nematodes if it isn't being used as a green manure. So if you're not plowing it into the ground and it's not being used as a biofumigant, and you're just letting it grow to be harvested or that sort of thing, we're still trying to kind of figure out what it does for vert nematodes. I've seen cases where it goes up, and I've seen cases where it goes down. So we're still trying to kind of build the data on that. Like any crop, you have to have adequate fertility to get maximum benefit. If you're trying to build organic matter or build value out of growing a non-commercial crop, you need to fertilize it to get the biomass, to get the value out of that crop so that it's helping you for the next crop. In this case with mustard, you definitely have to have enough nitrogen. You're probably talking 100 to 125 pounds nitrogen, and then probably somewhere between a 5 to 1 or 6 to 1 ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. So you're going to probably want at least 20 to 25 pounds of sulfur because the glucosinolates that are in the valuable chemical, which is in mustards, requires sulfur as part of that. So you definitely need to pay attention to that. Again, what are you trying to do? Wireworm versus, say, early dying and soil-borne diseases? That's going to determine whether you pick like a traditional brown mustard or a caliente mustard, like a hot mustard. Caliente mustard is about 3 times the cost of brown mustard in terms of seed cost, so just something to bear in mind. If you're doing the biofumigation, again, you're doing a little bit more tillage. So, if you're tilling that in July, August, ideally you're putting a cover crop in after. Doesn't have to be mustard, but something to keep the ground covered. You have to weigh the pros and cons of more tillage versus doing something to clean your soil. And one of the biggies, if you are using mustard for biofumigation, you need to have adequate soil moisture. So if it's bone dry in July and you're going out to put mustard in the ground, it's not going to have as much effect as if it was the ground was moist. So potentially try and time your incorporation around rain events when and if they happen. So I would say, again, that's something to bear in mind. Again, buckwheat, I'm looking at it from a wireworm bent and then maybe other things. AAFC has done some really good work the last 2 or 3 years or so, showing that buckwheat seems to be as effective as mustard in fighting wireworm without the need to actually put it into the ground. So just by growing, it releases a exudate from the roots, or is something in the roots that when the wireworm eat it, it basically slows their growth, retards their growth, and eventually they start dying off. And so we are seeing considerable use of buckwheat for wireworm, especially where you want to decrease tillage and that sort of thing. So it also has the potential for a cash crop. I know we had some folks from WA Grains at a presentation last month, and they were talking about maybe having a market for some buckwheat, so might be an option too if you want to actually grow it out for a crop. Other benefits for all rotations: it's a very fast establishing crop, it has a great reputation as a weed fighter, getting lots of ground coverage and choking out weeds, great soil conditioner, great tilth of the soil. It's a phosphorus scavenger, which you might say, oh well, we have lots of phosphorus usually in a lot of our fields, but it makes that phosphorus more available a lot of the time, and compared to some other cover crops, I'd say it has lower fertility requirements. Some considerations: it's not frost tolerant at all, so it's not a good fall cover crop choice. It needs to be planted in warm soil, so don't plant it too early. If you're in soybean pea rotation and it's maybe a tighter rotation, something to consider in terms of potential for white mold. We haven't seen a lot of white mold the last couple of years, but just something to consider. If you're just mowing it, so if it's a wireworm rotation, you're trying to just mow it to keep buckwheat in the field, it doesn't regrow as well as mustard does, so just something to consider there. We're still trying to figure out what it does on nematodes. Aaron tells me some of his data that it's good on nematodes. I've got some results that show the opposite, but we're still trying to kind of maybe figure that out a little bit. And again, probably not your ideal choice for building your soil organic matter, but it does have some real benefits in certain rotations. I'm not going to show you a whole lot of data. This is a trial we did in Eastern PEI a couple years ago with a participating grower. This was primarily around wireworm, and so he was looking at it in terms of what did these rotations do on wireworm. You can see that all of these rotations had a positive impact on reducing wireworm damage. The control was potatoes, followed by winter wheat, followed by soybean. So the damage was the highest in the control and definitely lower in the rest. These two here were fallow, so that's just mechanical and chemical fallow for 2 years in a row following potatoes, fallow followed by mustard. You can see it helped to control the wireworm, but it didn't help so much with the yields. But when we get into the yields, 2 years of buckwheat, we had about 6,500 hundredweight yield improvement on 2 years of buckwheat. We had 125 to 130 hundredweight in these two rotations, which that pays for a lot of cover crops. And it didn't do that just by more marketable tubers, but it also did it with more total yield as well. So you could tell that not only were more of the potatoes marketable, but there was more potatoes in total and more size in total. So our total yield was improving as well. We did some soil testing on this field. The one thing, nematode numbers were all what I would consider low in these fields. But when we got into things like verticillium, they started off with similar levels of verticillium in the spring, and you could see directly, this is right before soybean, right after soybean, before potatoes were planted, and you can see the soybean multiplied the verticillium considerably in that field. So soybean is a host for verticillium, usually not to the same degree potatoes is, but it can be a host for verticillium. Again, whether you're using mustard if you're using it mostly for wireworm control, this was a trial that Christine Nerona here at AAFC did a couple of years ago. But this was, the check is barley, I believe, and then we've got just mustard at different layers or different types, and you can see there's not much difference between mustard that's just clipped versus mustard that's put into the ground. Briefly on Sudan grass and pearl millet, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a blurb on those. It can be a trap crop for verticillium, and we have seen that it's really good for things like building soil organic matter, helping with compaction. You're seeing a lot more of this in potato rotations, replacing red clover particularly in a lot of rotations. So we've seen a lot more of that in the last couple of years. We've seen it's shown to have an impact on early dying in a lot of cases, but also a builder of soil organic matter, a compaction fighter. You can underseed it with forages like alfalfa if you're feeding cattle, you're a dairy producer, and you want high quality forage. It's an option there. A great soil conditioner. Just some considerations: don't plant it in cold soil, so you're going to be wanting 15-degree probably soil temperatures or higher, late June, early July. Don't let it get too mature and woody, or it can tie up nitrogen. If you're looking at an opportunity to do less fall plowing, you can work it in the spring so that you're not plowing so much at sensitive times of the year. Just not going to go through this too quick. Or too much. PEI, we've generally, a combination of grower trials and plot trials, we've generally seen somewhere around a 15% yield bump in potatoes following Sudan grass or pearl millet, those type of those warm season grasses. And we're hoping to look at more of these fields down the road, because that's an immediate boost to yield, but it's also what is it doing to the soil over time in terms of compaction, organic matter. That's usually not measured in just 1 year. And probably don't have time for other brassicas, tillage radish, oilseed radish. If you want to talk about that some more, you can talk to me. I'd say the jury's still out maybe on some of these things. They do make good rotation crops and cover crops. I guess the one thing I would say, if you're going to use tillage radish, I would recommend mixing it with a grass to get this. On the left-hand side is just tillage radish, and the right-hand side is radish with barley. You get more coverage. You get more soil protection doing that, and more biomass than tillage radish by itself. And that's what that looks like. So.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Is there any questions, Steve?